The life of a young American soldier often begins in a place that feels surprisingly ordinary. Before the uniforms, before the deployments, and before the political complexity of global conflict, there is usually a simple motivation, structure, purpose, and a belief that service offers something larger than individual ambition. For many recruits entering the United States military, the system is designed to shape them quickly. It replaces uncertainty with discipline, spontaneity with routine, and personal identity with a collective one. The young serviceman at the center of this story entered that system like thousands before him, stepping into an environment built on hierarchy, procedure, and unquestioned loyalty. The early stages of military life are intentionally predictable. Days begin before sunrise, often with the quiet tension of barracks corridors slowly waking to the sound of boots on concrete floors. Training fields become familiar landscapes, long stretches of gravel, faded obstacle courses, and instructors who speak with the steady authority of experience. Every movement is measured, every task repeated until it becomes instinctive. In this environment, individuality fades into the background. What matters is reliability, obedience, and trust in the chain of command. For the young soldier, this world initially made perfect sense. The military offered a kind of clarity that civilian life sometimes lacked. Expectations were defined. Goals were direct. The mission was always explained in terms of duty and national interest. Surrounded by fellow servicemen who shared the same routines, the same uniforms, and often the same ambitions, he found himself absorbed into a culture where loyalty was not just encouraged, it was expected as a fundamental principle. Military culture has a way of reinforcing that mindset. From the earliest stages of training, recruits are taught that their role exists within a much larger system. Individual concerns are secondary to the mission. Decisions flow downward through command structures designed to function even in moments of chaos. Trust becomes the invisible framework holding the institution together. Soldiers rely on one another, on their training, and on the belief that their leadership understands the broader strategic picture. For a long time, the young serviceman embraced that structure without hesitation. His career progressed through the normal stages of training and assignment, each step reinforcing the sense that he belonged to something organized and purposeful. Promotions and evaluations reflected competence rather than exceptionalism. He was not the most outspoken soldier, nor the most visible. Instead, he was the kind of serviceman who blended into the rhythm of military life, reliable, consistent, and largely unnoticed. Yet beneath that surface of stability, subtle changes were beginning to take shape. They did not arrive dramatically. There was no single moment when his perspective suddenly shifted. Instead, the transformation began quietly, influenced by the gradual accumulation of experiences that often accompany overseas deployments. For many soldiers, the first assignment abroad represents more than a professional obligation. It is also a cultural collision. The landscapes are unfamiliar. Languages shift. Civilian life operates under social rules that may contrast sharply with the assumptions soldiers carry with them. Markets, streets, and neighborhoods become windows into societies shaped by histories that are rarely explained in military briefings. During these deployments, the young serviceman encountered communities that existed far beyond the simplified geopolitical narratives often discussed in official settings. He observed daily life in regions where American military presence carried complex meanings, protection to some, intrusion to others. These encounters did not immediately alter his beliefs, but they introduced questions that lingered quietly in the background. At the same time, the emotional demands of military life began to accumulate in ways that are rarely visible from the outside. Long periods away from home created distance not only from family, but from the civilian identity he once understood clearly. Friendships inside the military were strong, yet temporary. Units rotated. Assignments changed. The stability of barracks life was balanced by the constant expectation that everything could shift with new orders. Isolation has a unique way of amplifying reflection. When soldiers spend extended time in foreign environments, surrounded by unfamiliar cultures and political tensions, the mind often searches for meaning beyond daily routines. For some, that reflection strengthens their commitment to service. For others, it gradually exposes uncertainties that had never been considered before. In the case of this young serviceman, the questions were subtle and deeply personal. They did not manifest as open criticism or visible dissatisfaction. Instead, they appeared as quiet moments of observation, watching the lives of civilians who navigated political realities very different from the narratives he had been taught. Conversations with locals, brief interactions in markets, and long stretches of time spent observing unfamiliar environments slowly expanded his awareness of perspectives outside the military framework. The geopolitical context surrounding these deployments added another layer of complexity. The regions where American forces operated were often shaped by decades of political tension, ideological rivalry, and shifting alliances. Soldiers were trained to understand the strategic objectives of their missions, but the human realities on the ground could feel far more complicated than the briefings suggested. Over time, the young soldier began to sense a quiet tension between the structured explanations he had learned within the military and the complex realities he was witnessing abroad. It was not yet a conflict of loyalty. At this stage, it was simply an awareness that the world outside the chain of command contained perspectives that were rarely discussed inside it. Despite these emerging reflections, his life within the military continued largely unchanged. Training schedules remained demanding. Assignments required discipline and focus. Evaluations measured reliability and performance rather than personal philosophy. To his superiors and fellow soldiers, he remained the same dependable serviceman he had always been. But internally, the process of observation had begun to reshape how he understood the world around him. The structured environment that once felt unquestionably clear now coexisted with experiences that introduced ambiguity. The cultural exposure of overseas service, combined with the emotional isolation of military life, created a quiet psychological space where reflection could grow. This stage of the story contains no dramatic decisions and no visible acts of rebellion. Instead, it represents the slow formation of a mindset that would later influence choices far more significant than anything he had yet considered. The pressures shaping his perspective were gradual and largely invisible, unfolding within the ordinary routines of military service. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. The soldier continued performing his duties, following orders, and participating in the disciplined rhythm that defines military life. Yet beneath that calm surface, the early foundations of a much larger transformation were beginning to form, one shaped not by a single event, but by the steady accumulation of experience, reflection, and the quiet complexities of a world far beyond the barracks walls. As the soldier's career moved forward, the routines that had once defined military life began to change in subtle ways. Early service had been built around structure and clarity, but time has a way of complicating even the most disciplined environments. Years of deployments, training cycles, and overseas assignments slowly transformed the simple identity he had once carried as a young recruit. The institution remained the same, predictable schedules, rigid hierarchies, and carefully defined missions, but the way he perceived that world was gradually shifting. At first, the changes were almost invisible. The soldier continued performing his duties with the same professionalism that had marked his early years. Evaluations still described him as dependable. Superiors still trusted him to complete assignments without complaint. Yet inside his mind, experiences accumulated quietly, forming a deeper awareness of the world surrounding the military structure he served within. Overseas deployments played a significant role in that transformation. For many soldiers, extended assignments abroad become an education that goes far beyond the technical aspects of military operations. The landscapes are different, but more importantly, the people living within those landscapes bring perspectives shaped by histories that American soldiers rarely grow up learning in detail. In small towns and crowded cities across foreign regions, the soldier began encountering ordinary civilians whose daily lives were deeply connected to the geopolitical conflicts shaping his own presence there. Markets opened before sunrise, filled with the familiar rhythms of trade and conversation. Families moved through streets that had existed for generations before foreign military forces ever arrived. The atmosphere carried a sense of continuity that felt older and more complex than the temporary nature of military deployments. These observations did not immediately produce conflict within him. In the early stages, they simply expanded his understanding of the places where he had been assigned to operate. But the longer he remained overseas, the more those observations began to challenge the simplified narratives he had learned earlier in his career. Military briefings often presented global conflicts in strategic terms: maps, alliances, threats, and objectives carefully summarized to support operational clarity. On the ground, however, the soldier increasingly noticed that reality rarely aligned perfectly with those brief explanations. The civilians he encountered were not abstract components of geopolitical strategies. They were individuals navigating complicated political environments that shaped their lives in ways far more personal than any official description could capture. Occasionally, brief conversations with locals offered glimpses into perspectives he had never considered before. These interactions were usually casual and short, but they carried emotional weight. People spoke about history, politics, and foreign military presence with a mixture of curiosity, frustration, and cautious politeness. The soldier rarely challenged their views, nor did he openly share his own opinions. Yet the exposure to those perspectives quietly planted questions that lingered long after conversations ended. Time spent away from home also intensified the process of reflection. Military life is structured, but can also be isolating. Long deployments create distance from familiar support systems, family, childhood friends, and the civilian environments that once defined personal identity. In their place, soldiers often rely on the routines of their units and the temporary communities formed within bases and outposts. For this soldier, those routines continue to provide stability, but they no longer carry the same sense of certainty they once had. The longer he served, the more he noticed small frustrations within the institution itself. Bureaucratic procedures sometimes slowed decisions that seemed straightforward on the ground. Leadership changes occasionally brought conflicting priorities. Policies developed far from the regions where soldiers operated could feel disconnected from the realities they faced each day. None of these issues were unique to his experience. Every large institution produces moments of inefficiency and disagreement. Yet when combined with the growing complexity of his observations abroad, they contributed to a subtle sense of detachment that gradually deepened over time. Psychologically, the shift was gradual and difficult to define. The soldier did not suddenly reject the values he had once believed in. Instead, he began comparing different versions of the same story. The narratives taught within the military emphasized national security, stability, and strategic necessity. The perspectives he encountered overseas often emphasized history, sovereignty, and the long memory of foreign involvement in regional affairs. Between those two interpretations, he found himself quietly searching for clarity. During long evenings on base, surrounded by the mechanical hum of generators and the distant movement of vehicles, reflection often filled the silence left behind by the day's activities. Soldiers sometimes cope with that silence through humor, distraction, or routine. Others use it as time for thought. For this serviceman, those quiet hours became moments when the questions he had encountered during the day slowly arranged themselves into deeper contemplation. He began reading more widely about the regions where he served, exploring historical accounts that stretched far beyond the timelines presented in official briefings. Political conflicts that once seemed recent revealed roots extending decades into the past. Foreign policies that appeared straightforward in modern summaries often traced back to complicated decisions made by multiple governments over many years. This expanding awareness did not immediately change his loyalty, but it gradually altered the framework through which he interpreted events around him. Instead of viewing conflicts purely through the lens of his role as a soldier, he began seeing them as part of a broader global conversation involving culture, history, and ideology. Meanwhile, the personal demands of military life continued accumulating quietly. The emotional distance from home, the repetitive cycle of deployments, and the pressure to maintain professional discipline in unpredictable environments created a psychological fatigue that many soldiers eventually experience. For some, that fatigue reinforces commitment to the institution. For others, it slowly erodes the sense of belonging that once felt unquestionable. In his case, the feeling was less about anger and more about distance. The military had shaped his identity for years, yet he increasingly felt as though he was observing the institution from slightly outside its emotional center. The structure remained familiar, but his connection to it felt less certain than it had before. By the time his assignments brought him closer to regions influenced by Iran's political and cultural sphere, that internal transformation was already well underway. The shift had taken place gradually, shaped by countless small observations rather than any single turning point. What began as curiosity had evolved into reflection, and reflection had slowly matured into a deeper questioning of the narratives that had once defined his understanding of the world. To the soldiers serving beside him, nothing appeared dramatically different. He continued fulfilling his responsibilities, maintaining the same disciplined routine that military life required. But internally, the foundation of his loyalty had begun to change shape, guided by years of exposure to perspectives and experiences that extended far beyond the environment where his career had first begun. There are moments in history when a decision made by a single individual quietly crosses the boundary between personal conviction and international consequence. These moments rarely arrive suddenly. More often, They are the final point of a long internal process that has unfolded slowly over time. Years of reflection, uncertainty, and psychological tension gradually narrowing into a single irreversible choice. For the American soldier whose story had begun within the disciplined structure of military life, that moment eventually arrived after a long period of internal transformation that few people around him had ever noticed. By the time his deployment brought him into regions shaped by the political influence and cultural presence of Iran, the conflict within his mind had already been developing for years. What began as simple curiosity during earlier assignments had matured into a deeper ideological struggle. The perspectives he had encountered abroad, combined with the frustrations he had experienced inside the military system, had reshaped how he interpreted the global conflicts surrounding him. Yet despite these changes, he remained physically inside the institution that had trained him, relying on the same routines and responsibilities that define the life of every other soldier. From the outside, nothing appeared dramatically different. His uniform was the same. His duties remained consistent. He moved through the structured environment of military operations with the calm professionalism that had always characterized his service. But internally, the distance between his personal beliefs and the mission he was expected to support had grown wider with each passing month. Psychological conflict within institutions like the military rarely expresses itself openly. The structure is designed to encourage discipline and discourage hesitation. Orders are followed not because every soldier fully agrees with them, but because the system depends on unity and reliability. For many servicemen, that structure provides clarity during difficult situations. For others, however, it can intensify feelings of isolation when personal convictions begin to diverge from institutional expectations. In his case, that divergence had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The geopolitical tensions surrounding Iran and the United States had long been framed in terms of rivalry and strategic opposition. Yet through years of observing international dynamics from closer proximity, he had begun interpreting those tensions through a more complex lens. The narratives he had encountered outside the military environment suggested that global conflicts were rarely as simple as they appeared in briefings or policy statements. These reflections did not immediately lead to action. Instead, they produced a growing sense that remaining within the military system required him to suppress questions that had become central to his understanding of the world. The longer he remained in that environment, the more he felt as though he was occupying two separate identities at once: the disciplined American soldier expected to carry out his duties, and the increasingly reflective observer who no longer felt fully aligned with the institution he represented. Eventually, the tension between those identities reached a psychological threshold. Decisions of this magnitude rarely emerge from a single moment of emotion. They develop through careful consideration, fear, and calculation. Defection is not simply an act of leaving. It represents the abandonment of an entire structure of identity, relationships, and national allegiance. For the soldier, the realization that such a step was even possible marked a profound turning point in his internal journey. It meant acknowledging that the path he had followed for years might not continue in the direction he once expected. The risks were immense. Leaving the American military without authorization carried severe legal consequences. Crossing into the control of a rival nation introduced uncertainties that could reshape the rest of his life. Despite those risks, the psychological pressure he had been carrying continued to intensify. The beliefs that had gradually formed during his years abroad had become too central to ignore. Remaining in place required him to live within a system that now felt fundamentally incompatible with his personal interpretation of the geopolitical reality surrounding him. When the moment of action finally arrived, it did not unfold with dramatic spectacle. The physical act of crossing into Iranian control was relatively quiet compared to the internal transformation that had preceded it. Yet the implications of that step were immediate and far-reaching. What had begun as the private struggle of a single serviceman quickly expanded into a matter of international attention. Within military and intelligence circles, defections carry significant strategic importance. Governments view them not only as individual choices, but also as potential sources of sensitive information. Analysts evaluate the motivations behind such decisions, attempting to understand whether they reflect ideological shifts, personal grievances, or calculated attempts to exchange knowledge for protection. Iranian authorities responded quickly once the soldier entered their control. For them, the arrival of an American serviceman represented both a political opportunity and a complex intelligence situation. Publicly, the event could be presented as evidence of ideological disagreement within the United States military. Privately, intelligence officials would assess what information the soldier might possess and how it could be used within broader geopolitical strategies. Meanwhile, inside the United States, the response unfolded through a different set of institutions. Military leadership initiated investigations to determine the circumstances surrounding the defection. Intelligence agencies evaluated the potential risks associated with the information the soldier might have carried with him. In the media, the story gradually emerged as a rare and controversial event, a reminder that the loyalties assumed within national institutions are not always as permanent as they appear. For observers around the world, the incident represented more than a personal decision. It became part of the ongoing narrative of rivalry between two nations whose relationship had long been defined by suspicion and political confrontation.